Well, once again, you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to my stories. There's no way I can respond to each of you individually, so I'm going to address some common things again, and then move on to the stories. I'm going to write as many as I can think of, in addition to my friends' stories. And I'll probably not update again until I get a clear answer to some questions that I have myself or my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found you all had. I'm not comfortable talking about where I work exactly. Unfortunately, in all reality, some of the things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble, or fired. So it's best if I don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States, in an area that is comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest, on a mountain range and a few lakes. There's still a great amount of interest in the stairs. And luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll all be very interested in. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I have ever thought of asking my superiors about them, I have. But again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works as an SAR officer. And it's possible that he may be willing to talk about it. I'll be speaking to him later in the week, and I'll let you all know what comes of it. As for advice on becoming an SAR officer, I think the best advice I can give you is to contact your local forest service and ask if they offer any training courses or what qualifications there are. I've been doing this for years, and I started out as a volunteer, helping out on SAR operations. It's a great job, despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, let's move on to the stories. The first happened on a case that I went out right after I got out of training. I was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I had a basic idea of what to expect. But on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As an SAR officer, you go out for all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called in early in the morning from a young couple who were up on one of the trails that goes by the lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging for us to come right away. When we get there, we see him holding his wife. She's got something in her arms. She's screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams. And he's sobbing. He sees us and he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there. Obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up to the walking path. So we ask him if his wife needs help, if she can walk on her own or something. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking something and just shrieking over and over. I crouch down and see that whatever she's holding, it's covering her with blood. It's when I notice the sling on her front, and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms open gently, so they can see what she's holding, and it's her baby. dead. His head is caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this situation just hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself. And I get up and go get one of the other vets who's standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid. He sort of pats my shoulder and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see her kid. Every time we try to take him away from her, she flips out, tells us we can't have him, that he'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But eventually, one of the vets manages to calm her down, and she gives us the baby. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMT showed up, they told us there was never any hope of saving the baby. He died instantly from the trauma to his head. I was good friends with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital. And she told me later what happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling. He stopped because the kid was fussing. Dad takes the kid and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to them, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil. She trips. She falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling about 20 feet down this little gully onto the rocks at the bottom. The dad climbed down and recovered the kid, but he'd fallen right on his head and was dead by the time he got there. The baby was about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, a series of events that coalesced into the worst possible outcome. Probably one of my more awful calls. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as an SAR officer. Mostly because there aren't that many animals that come around the area. While there are bears in the area, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are small ones like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently though are moose. And let me tell you, moose are nasty fuckers. They'll chase after anything for any reason. And God help you if you get in between a female and its baby. One of the more amusing calls was that of a guy who got chased down by an absolutely massive male moose. He was stuck up a tree. Took us almost an hour to get him down. And when he finally landed on solid ground again, he looks at me and just goes, "God damn, those fuckers big up close." I know it's not really a scary story, but we laugh about it from time to time. Can't believe I'm talking about this one. I honestly don't know how I forgot this one. But it is by far the scariest thing that's happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it didn't really come to me. As someone who spends literally all their time in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone, out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this, you tend to just forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me really seriously consider if this is the right job for me. I don't really like talking about it much, but I'll do the best I can to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. 4-year-old girl had wandered off away from our campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent and told us what most parents do. My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close. That sort of stuff. We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her. And we spread out in the standard search formation. I was partnered up with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually holding conversations while we hiked. I know it sounds callous, but you do sort of become desensitized when you've done this long enough. It becomes the norm. And I think to a certain extent, you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to work this job. We searched for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we think she'd be. We come out of a small valley, and something makes us both stop in unison. We both freeze and look at each other, and there's almost a sensation like a plane decompressing. My ears pop, and I have this odd sensation of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest sound I've ever heard. It's almost like a freight train passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below us. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him over this deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we look all around us, trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us sees anything. Of course, my first thought is a landslide, but we're not close to any cliffs. And even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound goes on, and we're trying to yell at each other, but even standing close by, we can't hear anything but this sound. Then suddenly, as it came, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a couple of seconds, perfectly still. Then slowly the normal sounds of the woods come back. He asks me what the fuck just happened, but I just kinda shrug. We start looking at each other for a minute. I get on the radio and ask if someone else just heard the end of the fucking world, but no one else heard it. Even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I just sort of shrug it off, keep going. And about an hour later, we all check on the radios and no one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark. But because we don't have any kind of lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my friend. We keep close together, and we're calling out for her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope we find her. Because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being all alone in the dark is awful. The woods can be intimidating to an officer like me, but to a kid, it's a whole different kind of beast. When the sun goes down, can't imagine. We keep looking, but we're not seeing any signs of her or getting any responses. And around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines his light to the right of us into a really thick deadfall, or a group of trees. I ask him if he's heard anything. He just tells me to be quiet for a second and listen. I do, and in the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both call for the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's just a really faint crying sound. We head in the direction of this deadfall and go around it. calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start getting this weird feeling in my gut, and I tell my buddy that something isn't right. He tells me he feels the same, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again. And at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying. It's on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, then wail, then quiet hiccup, repeated over and over. Exactly the same every time. And without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong. And neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous point, we asked if someone else had heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds anticlimactic, but that call just fucked me up for a long time. As for that little girl, we never found a trace of her. We keep an eye out for her and all the other people who we've never found. But frankly, I doubt we'll ever find them. Of the missing persons calls I've gone on, only a handful have resulted in complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person and no body ever found. But sometimes finding a body leads to even more questions. Here's some of the bodies that we found that have become infamous in our team. A teenage boy whose remains were recovered almost a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera almost 40 miles from where he was last seen. The camera was sadly destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who had vanished a month earlier. That was all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy, and the highest peak of a ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome, almost 20 miles from where she was last seen. She had died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact except her shoes and jacket. They were buried in cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. The coroner said it appeared as someone had been taking care of her. There were no suspects ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old boy, found a week after vanishing in a hollowed tree trunk 10 miles from the area he was last seen. It was fresh milk found in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground her family had been at the previous summer. Now on to a couple of stories my friend told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and you're in luck. He's had a close encounter with them, though he doesn't have any explanation for them. He does have a bit of experience. Well, more experience than I do, at least. My buddy has been a search and rescue officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the same thing mine did, which was to never go near, touch, or ascend them. For the first year, he did just that. But apparently his curiosity got the better of him. And on one call, he broke away from the line and went back to check a set of them out. He said they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished. The dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house, because the carpet was pristine and white. He said that as he got closer, he didn't feel any different or hear any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The only thing he said that was odd was that there was absolutely no debris on the stairs. No dirt, no leaves, dust, anything. And there didn't appear to be any signs of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which he found strange. It was less like things were avoiding them and more like they just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and didn't feel anything except that sort of sticky feeling you get from new carpet. Making sure his ready was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said it was terrifying, because the way they'd been stigmatized, he wasn't really sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported to some other dimension, and the other half was watching for a UFO to come slipping down. But he got to the top with little wind. He stood there, looking around. But he said the longer he stood on the top, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you'd get if you were in a part of a government building you have no business being in. As if someone was going to come in and arrest you, or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. Tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger. And that's when he realized he couldn't hear anything. The sounds of the forest were gone. He couldn't even hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but more oppressive. He climbed back down, rejoined the search, and the sounds of the forest and his own breathing returned. Of course, he didn't mention what he had done. But he said the weirdest part came after. His trainer was waiting back at the welcome center after the search ended for the day, and he cornered my friend before he could leave. He said his trainer had this look of intense anger, and he asked what was wrong. You went on them, didn't you? My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how his trainer knew. Trainer just shook his head. Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost their scent. My buddy asked what that had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he had been on the stairs. And my buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave this really awful, almost dead-eyed look and told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs again, he'd be fired immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he's never answered any of the questions my buddy has. My buddy has been involved in a lot of missing persons cases, where there's never been a trace of them found. I mentioned David Paulites, and my buddy said he can confirm that those stories are true. He said that most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found or they're found weeks, months, or years later in places they can't possibly have gotten to. One story he told me really stood out and involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental disability. The little boy vanished from a picnic area in the late fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped, and his parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone had to have taken him. My buddy said they searched for this kid for weeks, going miles out of this expected range. But it was like he had never been there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere. Not even in the picnic area, where he'd apparently vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their kid. The search was concluded about a month later. My buddy said everyone had pretty much forgotten it by the later in the winter. He was out on a training op in the snow on one of the higher peaks when he came across something in the snow. He said he saw it from far away at first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking part way out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kid because it had a distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, lying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been dead for any longer than a day, even though he had been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something, and my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was. He said he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a big chunk of ice that had been carved crudely to look like a person. The kid was holding it so tight that it had frostbitten his chest and hands, which my buddy could tell even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed the rest of the crew and they took the body up the mountain. Now he recapped all of this for me, and to put it simply, there was no way this kid could have survived for almost 3 months on his own or had gotten to this peak. There was no physical way this kid could have walked almost 50 miles and ended up on top of a goddamn mountain. To top it all off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing. Not even water. It was like my buddy said, the kid had been taken off of the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and dropped on this mountainside months later, only to die of exposure. He's never really gotten over that one. The last story I'll share from him was one that took place relatively recently, only a few months ago. They were out doing a recon for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple days. One of our jobs is to scout out these areas where these animals are seen to ensure that if they are in that area, he can warn people and close off those trails. He was out on his own in a very heavily forested part of the park towards dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when the mountain lion screams, it sounds almost like a woman being brutally murdered. It's utterly unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back and let Op knows that they had heard one, and that he was going to keep going to see if he could figure out where its territory started. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determine the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time only within a few yards of him. Of course, he freaks out and starts heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wants to run into is a goddamn mountain lion, get mauled to death. As he got back on the trail and started heading back, the screaming started following him, and he broke into a jog. When he was about a mile away from Ops, the screaming suddenly stopped. He turned around to see if it was following him. It was almost night by this point, but he said in the distance just before the path rounded the corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning that the area was closed and that he needed to come back to the welcome center. The figure just stood there, and my buddy started to walk over. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step towards him and let out the same scream my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to Ops, never looking behind him, while the screaming followed. By the time he got back, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone else, just said there was a mountain lion in the area and that they had to close those paths until the animal could be located and moved. I'm going to end this entry here, since it's turned into a huge wall of text. I'm going to be heading out for a yearly training ops tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. I'll be meeting with a lot more former trainers and buddies who work in other areas of the park. And I'll be asking around about any stories they'd like to share. I'm so glad you guys have been interested in my stories, and once I'm back from the ops, I'll continue to share them.